Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive with Dr. Rebecca Risk. Do you ever feel that even though nothing seems seriously wrong and you pass all the medical tests, that you still feel that your health, pain, and fatigue are completely out of control? It doesn't have to be that way. Listen to the tips and suggestions given on our program today and take back control of your health. Now, here is Dr. Rebecca Risk.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today, we're talking with Julie Rehmeyer. She is an award-winning freelance math and science journalist and contributing editor at Discover magazine. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Oprah magazine, Discover, Science News, Wired, and many others. Today, we're discussing her memoir, Through the Shadowlands, a science writer's odyssey into an illness science doesn't understand. Julie, welcome to the show.
I'm so pleased to be here.
You know, I'm excited to have you here. When I found your book, I knew that this would be a perfect topic for this show. I think, you know, having read it yesterday, that what you went through is why I do the show. I'm called Falling Through the Cracks for a reason. And you know, my goal is to bring information to people who can't get help the same way that you couldn't. And I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how your journey started and what happened for you.
Sure. It started very gradually at a time of an enormous amount of stress. I was building my own house. I was working full-time, and my husband at the time was going through a severe illness. So it was really, you know, kind of over-the-top stressful time, and I was really exhausted. And at the time, I mostly thought, well, of course I'm exhausted. You know, my life's a mess. I'm working way too hard. Who wouldn't be exhausted? But it was on a level that was a little more than what you would expect. You know, I found myself like tracing my hand along the wall as I walked to the bathroom because I was afraid I might pass out, which is not exactly just ordinary exhaustion. But still, I figured, well, you know, finish the house, get my life in order, and everything will be okay. And I did finish the house, and I did get my life in order, and everything wasn't really okay. I got a little better, but I continued to have real problems with exercise. Exercise just didn't feel good the way that it used to. And then things started getting worse. After that, I started having much more problems with exercise. You know, just kind of weird things happened. I had a week of that I called a flu, but it wasn't really like a flu I'd ever had. Like just a general sense of something going wrong. And at that point when I exercised, then I really, really paid for it the next day. I would be pretty much in bed, just exhausted and hurting and exhausted. And so then, you know, even then I thought, okay, well, something's wrong here. I'll try to figure it out. But I was kind of trying to not be too worked up about it. But then I woke up one morning and I couldn't walk. I had gotten a hepatitis A vaccine in preparation for a trip to Peru. And about 24 hours after I got that vaccine, I was just completely exhausted, went to bed, slept for about 24 hours, woke up, and I couldn't walk. And that was really terrifying. And that was the first time that I said, okay, something is, you know, clearly really, really, really wrong here, and I have to get a doctor to figure it out.
So when you went down that road to see doctors and that, what came out of that?
So I went to a neurologist first because I figured, well, you know, the signals don't seem to be reaching from my brain to my legs to allow me to walk, so it must be a neurological problem. And staggered into his office, really barely able to move at all. And he did a few very cursory tests, and then he told me that there was nothing neurologically wrong with me and that I had chronic fatigue syndrome. And I was so shocked. I'd wondered for years if I might have chronic fatigue syndrome at the stage when I was really tired, but like this wasn't tired, you know, I couldn't walk. It was a completely different thing. And I was especially shocked when then I was like, okay, so if it's chronic fatigue syndrome, what do I do? You know, are there tests? Are there doctors? Are there treatments? What's the next step? And he had absolutely nothing to say. And it was clear that for him, that diagnosis meant, please get out of my office. I have nothing to offer you.
You know, although I'm not surprised, because this is actually, stories I hear every day in my office. I'm just, I'm just wondering, it didn't even seem like he did a lot of testing. He just kind of looked at you and said, "This is where you are." And so how did that feel to you that you weren't even with him for very long? There wasn't follow-up testing. Like, what happened with all of that, and with your care as well?
Yeah, so I, of course, went to see a bunch of other doctors as well, and both chronic fatigue syndrome specialists and other neurologists and endocrinologists and, anybody who seemed relevant. I eventually concluded that basically doctors just didn't have anything to offer. Another neurologist I went to suggested that it was conversion disorder. In other words, it was all in my head. The chronic fatigue syndrome specialist I went to was sort of like halfway between a real doctor and a quack. I couldn't really figure him out. There was, a lot that made me uncomfortable. He had pictures of semi-naked women as ads for cellulite treatments, like just really not something that I was comfortable with, but at the same time he had plausible sounding treatments, although then they did nothing for me. So eventually I just felt like, none of these people really know anything about this. And what I discovered that really made a difference for me was being extremely careful not to overdo it. The way I figured this out was in these kind of early days after the paralysis started, I woke up one morning feeling much better. And I was, I could walk, I could move, I felt pretty good. And so I thought, okay, time to go to the grocery store. I need some groceries. And then partway through the grocery store trip, I started getting tired, but I didn't feel like I could just stop. And so I finished and got my groceries home. And by the time I got home, I was completely exhausted. And then that night, I couldn't even make it to the bathroom. I couldn't even crawl to the bathroom. And that was kind of when the light bulb went on, and I realized, okay, I did too much and that made it worse, so let's try being really, really careful to not overdo it. And that made a really enormous difference. And for quite a few years, that was really one of my main management strategies. And by doing that, and various other tricks that I found along the way, I was able to have a kind of constrained but semi-normal life. And I also just had this sort of hope that it would just fade away and everything would be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Since nobody seems, it seems like, okay, well, there's nothing that doctors can recognize as wrong with me, so it's some weird thing and somehow it'll just all be okay. And I also focused a lot at that point on sort of keeping calm about it, limiting what it took from my life, trying to strategize to live as kind of richly as I could within the constraints that it imposed on me. And for some years that felt like a workable strategy. It got better and it got worse. And there were times when it was fairly problematic and times when I was almost well. And then in late 2010, I was in a good period, good enough that I could go on, say, 3-mile gentle hikes. And on one such hike, I was about a mile from home in, the middle of nowhere, somewhere that nobody else ever really goes. And I started getting tired. And I knew that was time to stop, that if I kept going at all, I would pay for it. But I was a mile into the wilderness. So I didn't have a choice. And so I rested for a while, and then I kept walking, and then I rested, and then I kept walking. And I knew that I was going to pay. And I ended up paying with a year in bed. for the next year, I was bedbound about half the time, and really just, it was kind of, at that point, it was kind of game over. I mean, I couldn't really work. I couldn't really think clearly. I sometimes couldn't even turn over in bed. It was really quite terrifying.
I want to talk about this more. We are going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back to this. We're talking today with Julie Rehmeyer. She's the author of Through the Shadowlands, A Science Writer's Odyssey into an Illness Science Doesn't Understand. We'll be back shortly.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
The largest syndicated alternative health talk program has come to the Voice America Network. The Dr. Bob Martin Show is the program that will answer your health questions and help you to heal your own body of many different ailments. Each week, you'll hear the answers that Dr. Bob gives to his callers that help them to be their own doctor most of the time. We'll also discuss developments on the healthcare front and what you need to do to keep your body in top form. The Dr. Bob Martin Show airs Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
The Voice America Live Events channel is here now to showcase your corporate, individual, or organization's live event. Visit voiceamerica.com/live events to see all of our past live events and find out more. Whether it's a multi-day conference, special speaker, or single-day event, we've got everything to make your event a success. We can do a few hours or a few days. For more information about taking your event to the next level, call Jeff Spinard at 480-294-6417 or email info@voiceamerica.com. Again, that's Jeff Spinard at 480-294-6417 or send us an email to info@voiceamerica.com. Voice America is where you are and where you want to be. Join us around the globe as we broadcast live from some of the most interesting events available. Don't forget to view all our live events, including on-demand access to past events that you may have missed by visiting voiceamerica.com/live events.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Julie Rehmeyer. We're discussing her memoir, Through the Shadowlands. Now, Julie, before the break, you talked about how sick you were and that you couldn't get out of bed. And I want to just bring everybody's attention to what you were like before you were sick. I think that's actually really important. You were very active, and it was something that you loved to do. And if you can just tell us a little bit, because as we get talking to more about your diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome and just how people view that, I think it's important for them to understand the mindset that you came from.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So before I got sick, I ran a marathon. I built my own house out of straw bales. I was on a search and rescue team, rescuing people in the wilderness. I was very, very active. I loved exercise. You know, it was a real source of pleasure for me, and also kind of a management tool for managing stress and just generally, feeling good. That was really something that I relied on. So when I started having trouble with exercise, it was really a shock and just hard. It's like, but I need to exercise. Like, this is part of how I feel good. I think another thing that's important to know in terms of my background is that I'm a science writer, and so when I first started getting seriously sick, of course, I turned to science. That was the obvious place to go. And when doctors had so little to offer me, then I dug into the scientific literature myself to see what I could figure out. And I was pretty shocked at what I found, because what I found was almost nothing. I mean, the scientific literature on chronic fatigue syndrome at the time was so weak and spotty, small studies that were very uncertain, that had never been followed up on, all kinds of problems in the research literature. And that was really, it was appalling to me. And I felt kind of abandoned, I felt abandoned by medicine, I felt abandoned by doctors, I felt abandoned by science, and it was a huge shock.
So, I can definitely relate to that in my journey to discover that I had chronic Lyme, which took 14 years. And I think if I'm right, your journey took 7. When you look at that, it's a huge chunk of your life. Yeah, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, and I was waiting for my Lyme test to come back at that time. And of course, I had that conversation with the rheumatologist that I was seeing, and told that I was wasting my money, and the doctor I was seeing was a quack. And although we're then recognizing what I do for a living, and then, he's like, I'm sure you're different though, being more in, practicing Chinese medicine was a little on his end of, I was wasting people's time and money as well. And, it's then, 3 weeks later, I was diagnosed with Lyme, and, it was, and we haven't got to what, your light bulb and your illness yet, but that's what it felt like to me. But in that process, in that 14 years of, I was a young woman. I was 21 when I started looking, and I was told I had anxiety. I was young, and I would get over all my issues. When I hit almost 30, and I was sicker, and my symptoms had developed up to 120, I was told, well, you know what? You're almost 30 now. This is the way it's going to be. Ignore, And so I couldn't win, and I pointed that out to a doctor, and he was like, yeah, well, it's the way it is. And it seems like that's a lot of what was happening with you as well, that, well, now you have chronic fatigue. Why are you still here? Why are you still going to doctors, right? It's kind of the sense I got as well.
Right. Yeah, very much so. And I think sexism plays a huge role in these illnesses not getting taken seriously. And women, over and over and over in the healthcare system end up being told it's all in their head, it's just anxiety, they're depressed. And when, it's a kind of cycle that feeds on itself, because these illnesses that affect us predominantly are less studied, and sexism plays a role in that. And then because they're less studied, doctors don't know what to say. They don't like not having anything to offer. And so then they blame it on us by saying it's all on our heads. And then when there is this general perception that these illnesses are somehow not real illnesses, then they don't deserve to be studied. And so there's no research on it. And it's this ever-tightening cycle that leaves women sick and untreated.
And I think another part of that is, we're given the diagnosis of conversion disorder, which is considered, mental illness causing your symptoms, and I'm wondering if after that and after the chronic fatigue diagnosis, it was just like, well, this is in your head, so why are you here? And they're kind of done with looking.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I also just gave up. I mean, particularly after the neurologist said I had conversion disorder, it just felt like, it actually felt kind of dangerous dealing with these doctors, they're going to throw me in the loony bin, I felt really unsafe in those situations.
Well, and you mentioned that in your book as well, that you had heard stories where that had happened. So maybe you can just tell people why you felt afraid of pursuing your symptoms further.
That's right. So So it's really, this is more of a problem outside the U.S. than it is in the U.S., but there are the most horrifying stories of what's happened to people. There's a young woman in Denmark who got thrown into a psychiatric ward and kept against her will for years, a young woman with chronic fatigue syndrome. Her parents were not allowed to see her for extended periods of time, and she only got released a year ago or so, something like that, a little over a year ago, and during that time she deteriorated dramatically. There were periods when she was unable to communicate at all, and at this point I don't know how she's doing. I think her family is, trying to just sort of be quiet and give everyone time to kind of heal and adjust to the new reality. But it's horrifying. It's completely horrifying. And that is fueled by some really terrible research that I actually have done quite a bit of work to tear down. There was a study done in Britain called the PACE trial. It was the largest treatment trial that's ever been done in chronic fatigue syndrome, and it claimed to show that cognitive behavioral therapy and graded exercise therapy are effective treatments for the illness. And this was based on this theory that what was going on with the illness was that people got a bad bug or something like that, and they got out of shape, and then they just sort of freaked out and believed they had some continuing illness that prevented them from exercise, and so they didn't exercise regularly to build back up, and that was what was perpetuating their symptoms, so they just needed to get over this silly idea they had that they were sick and get active again, and they would be just fine. And in England, if you refuse graded exercise therapy, which means gradually increasing exercise, if you refuse to do that, which is actually a very dangerous treatment for this illness, you may well be deprived of disability payments. It's often a precondition for disability payments. It's really a shocking situation.
So now there is a lot of controversy over this study, and can you just tell us what that is? Yeah.
So the study came out when I was at my very sickest in 2011, and again, often too sick to turn over in bed, and I just kind of couldn't believe it. And particularly because I'm a science writer, I thought that a large study published in The Lancet that got pretty much consistent positive press coverage, I thought, well, it must be okay, but it didn't make any sense. And over the coming months, I dug into it more, and I realized it was a shockingly bad study. So just to give you one example, there are so many problems I couldn't, we would be here all day talking about all the problems, but just one of them is you could enter the trial, get worse on the two main measures that they used that tracked fatigue and physical function. You'd get sicker, and they could say you had recovered. So you get worse. You come in, you're disabled according to their reports. You get worse, and they say you're recovered. Just stunning.
It is, and when I was reading what you're writing about it, they have the graduated exercise, but the cognitive behavior therapy, and with the way that you put it, the cognitive behavior therapy makes you look at your symptoms in a different way, so don't be as aware of them, and then they won't bother you as much. So that doesn't mean that they're not there, and even worse, you're trying to do what you were told to do during the study. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's another really key problem with this. They're telling you you're staying sick because you're too focused on your symptoms. So focus on your symptoms less, and you'll feel better. And then they say, okay, so how are your symptoms now? And what are you going to say? I guess they're not quite as bad as.
Because I'm trying not to be aware of them, and
I say, oh, great, you're better. They worked.
Well, and it didn't even. it doesn't sound like there's other ways to measure how people are dealing with fatigue and exercise. So, it sounds like they didn't even have the proper tools to study people of how they had handled things, like just also to go by, especially when you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy and then you're measuring what somebody says of how they feel.
Right.
And then the other issues
fact,
with the trial.
They originally planned to measure people's activity levels with basically a pedometer, and which, makes sense, like actually track and see, are people more active? And then they got rid of that measure. They claimed it was too much of an imposition on the patients, and so they got rid of it. And the only measures that they relied on and where they reported success were subjective ones. In this case, these researchers are so invested in this theory. It is their careers that they have spent promulgating this. And so I really think the incentives are set up in a way where they have a very, very, very heavy incentive to say that this works. And so they basically just manipulated the data to get the results that they wanted to have.
Which isn't how studies and trials are supposed to go.
Not at all.
So,
and there are problems in so many levels. It's the original research, but then it's also the fact that the Lancet published it. It's also the fact that journalists ate it up. I mean, it was ballyhooed in headlines around the world. And they did not listen at all to patients when patients complained. And in fact, these researchers claimed that they had received death threats from these crazy patients. And then the journalists completely ran with that story without actually confirming it. And in fact, later, the researchers were forced to admit that neither the PACE trial researchers nor any of the PACE trial recipients had ever received a threat of any kind.
That's pretty crazy. So how were people portrayed that were arguing against this?
This death threat thing had an incredible impact because, they were portrayed as loonies. They were portrayed as crazy people who were anti-science and just didn't want their illness portrayed as psychiatric, even though obviously it was. They were not taken seriously at all. Things have, however, changed enormously in this regard. And it's really like there's a single journalist gets an enormous amount of the credit for it. So David Tuller actually wrote the New York Times story about the PACE trial that was better than most, but still fundamentally credulous about the trial, and then he got contacted by patients saying, whoa, there are big problems. And unlike other journalists, he listened and he paid attention. And he realized that the patients were right. There were huge problems. And so he really took this on, and he did a huge expose and has basically devoted his career to it for the last several years. He managed to get serious scientific attention to the flaws in the trial for the first time, and he orchestrated an open letter to the Lancet demanding that the trial be retracted that was signed by over 100 researchers. And largely as a result of efforts from him and also from me and other people in the chronic fatigue syndrome community, the CDC has actually changed its recommendations, and it no longer recommends cognitive behavioral therapy or graded exercise therapy on its website, which is really a huge victory.
Well, it is a huge victory, but in your book, it sounded like that was kind of a secret that they no longer recommended.
Yeah, well, actually, that happened after the book came out. That happened just this summer, but but it's true that they have not publicized the change at all. So most doctors don't know. They have been recommending this now for decades, and they changed the recommendation, but they have not let doctors know about the change at all. So that's the problem.
So it's still being recommended. I mean, I have a patient who's in this situation with insurance for work, and she's told she'll just get better if she exercises more. And this is coming from a chronic fatigue specialist that the insurance company made her meet with. And this is recent, and the awareness isn't there yet, and it does come from the responsibility of higher up to educate the doctors in their system to know that this is going on. And you do mention in your book the patients know more, and the patients know more because their life is debilitated, and they're doing the research, right?
That's right.
For in situations like you and I were in, where we were losing so much of our lives, we had no choice. And
That's
you
exactly
definitely
right.
You had no choice. You had to, in essence, save your own life to figure out what was going on and to regulate your own life. It's very clear
right.
it's very clear in your book. Exercise was not your answer, right?
Right.
I mean, you tried very hard to have that normal life, and it didn't work for you, and so it baffles me that with I think you say there's about 1 million people affected, and if there's that many people this sick, why we can't see that there's something wrong with what we're doing with this illness.
Yeah, it's really a shocking thing, and it was incredibly eye-opening for me, that I had imagined that our research and medical systems, I mean, of course, aren't perfect, right? I wasn't dumb. I knew that there were with any big system like that, there are things that don't work ideally, but I really had no idea the level of problems that were there. And I had no idea that that kind of how poor a guide respectability is. I ended up finding answers in places that seemed very unrespectable, and it really changed my view of things. I realized that the kind of shorthands that we use to assess whether what somebody says is reliable or not can be really, really wildly off base.
Well, so what did you end up finding out that was going on for you?
Yeah, so what happened for me was, and we kind of left my personal story during the year when I was really, really, really sick, and by then I went off to the very top chronic fatigue specialists in the world. They really didn't have any answers for me ultimately. And so I was pretty much out of kind of reasonable, respectable approaches to take at that point. And so I ended up getting contacted by some patients who claimed that that by taking extreme measures to avoid mold, that they had gone from being sicker than I was to largely recovered. And my initial reaction when I heard this was, yeah, right. Everybody has some dumb idea about this illness, and this doesn't sound like a particularly good one to me. And I was also skeptical because chronic fatigue syndrome patients commonly vary a lot in how well they do. The illness is often relapsing and remitting, and so if you get better, then you're going to be inclined to attribute your getting better to something. Whatever you've been doing lately, you'll say, oh, it finally worked. And it may be that it just was random, it just happened to be a moment when you had a remission. And so I was very, very doubtful. But at the same time, I continued listening to these folks, and I was impressed by them. They were a really smart, thoughtful group of people. And as they talked more about their theories about the illness, I realized that what they were saying actually made as much sense as anything else I'd ever heard, including from top specialists. And basically their theory was that toxic mold causes all kinds of immune problems, and among other things, and that in combination with other hits like a bad virus or a physiological stress of some kind, that it can kind of push your body over the edge into this state of chronic fatigue syndrome. And I couldn't, at that point, I was too sick to really do serious research about it, and so I didn't know of any research to back them up. I actually did later find that there was research that at least suggested that this theory was plausible. But at the time, I didn't know that at all, and was really just driven by desperation. I was out of kind of reasonable things to try, and so either I was just going to kind of rot in bed and hope for a miracle, or I was going to try something that didn't seem so reasonable to me. And their recommendation was that I go to a particularly pristine desert for 2 weeks with none of my own belongings. And this would allow my body to get clear of mold. And their prediction was that when I came home, I would react really clearly and strongly to my own stuff. And then I would know that mold was indeed making me sick. And this was such a wild prediction because I had never had any obvious reaction to mold. I'd lived in all kinds of different houses. It never seemed to matter. None of them had any terrible mold problem. So the idea that I would, come home and suddenly dramatically be made sick by my own stuff was kind of hard to imagine. At the same time, it appealed to me because it was an experiment, it was a chance to conduct an experiment and get an answer. And I was on just enough of an upswing at that moment that I thought I hoped I could pull it off, and so off I went.
So let's, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to find out what happened when you came back from the desert. We're talking today with Julie Rehmeyer, and we're discussing her book, Through the Shadowlands. We'll be back shortly.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
Take us on the go. It's even easier now. The Voice America Talk Radio Network has launched our mobile app for iPhone, Android, or BlackBerry. Visit the Apple iTunes App Store, BlackBerry App World, or Android Market to download the app powered by Aircast. It's free and no registration is necessary. In minutes, you could be enjoying your favorite Voice America Talk Radio host, no matter where you are, in the car, out and about, while traveling, or anytime you can't be close to your computer. Catch up on the archives you've missed or discover new shows on the spot. Search Voice America at your favorite app store.
What causes us to be sick? We're not talking about the actual illness or the scientific cause of illnesses. We're talking about your body and health. Listen for the healing whisper of return to peace. Each week, host Dr. Marianne Chase shows you how to listen to your heart to identify poor health, stress, and disease. You'll learn how to heal energetically and spiritually as well as physically. It's time to depend less on the drugs and more on the heart. The Healing Whisper airs live every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
Follow the Voice America Talk Radio Network on Twitter. We're at Voice America TRN. You'll get the latest fix on what's happening with our shows, this week's featured guests, and general happenings that you should know about at the Voice America Talk Radio Network. Now you don't have to miss anything when you're away from your home or office. Just go to twitter.com/Voice America TRN or follow along with us at Voice America TRN, the Voice America Talk Radio Network. We're on the cutting edge of social media. Can you keep up?
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're talking with Julie Rehmeyer. We're discussing her memoir, Through the Shadowlands, a science writer's odyssey into an illness that science doesn't understand. So, Julie, we left at the break at a cliffhanger. You went into the desert to see if your belongings were making you sick from mold. And what happened when you came home?
So when I came home, I spent 30 seconds where I was living around my own stuff, and I wasn't able to walk afterward. And while I'd been in the desert, that hadn't happened at all. And so it was really clear and dramatic and pretty shocking to me. I was so skeptical about the whole thing that on the one hand, I'd invested a lot and really hoped it was true, and on the other hand, I really didn't think it would be. But then I got so many really clear confirmations. You know, I could just handle some papers of my own, you know, from where I was living and get crippled afterward. So I stayed I stayed with friends and away from my stuff. And a week after I got back, I had a day when I was feeling pretty good, and I thought, well, I'll take my dog for a little bit of a walk. I'm sure I'm not up for much, but I can stretch my legs a bit. Well, I ended up walking to the top of a 350-foot hill behind my house, and I was so blown away. I hadn't been able to do that for a year and a half, and was just like in tears, and I took a picture and sent an email to my friends who had been following my saga, and the subject line was, "Oh my God." I just couldn't believe it. And so at that point, I figured, well, you know, I still had a skeptical voice that somehow I had, like, just persuaded myself of this, and it wasn't really true. But when it had such an incredible positive impact, I thought, okay, well, if this is all a placebo effect, well, that's good enough for me.
As long as you feel better. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I literally got rid of almost everything I owned, and I moved and had a really, like, remarkable, amazing improvement. I was, you know, exercising again. Within, like, less than a year, I was running long distances, like 12 miles. Just really kind of a stunning improvement.
So I want to talk a little bit more about mold, because I know if people haven't heard this before, they're probably going to think, I think what your initial reaction was, that this is crazy. And, right. You know, knowing that it's not recognized in our system. I mean, I lived when I was in school in a house that had mold, and I ended up at a respiratory specialist, and he told me mold doesn't cause respiratory problems or the fevers I was having or anything like that. And then finally I moved out of my house and I was fine. You know, and it's very common for this not to be recognized.
Very common.
Yeah, and I know that was your initial reaction was, you know, you were hearing this on Facebook, and this can't be, you know, what's going on. So what is actually happening? Yeah.
So, you know, much later than I did do a whole bunch of research about it, since I'm a science writer and wanted to understand what the scientific literature had to say about it. And what I learned is that there's actually a lot of evidence that mold can do bad things. That's actually pretty much uncontroversial. In particular, it's a very serious issue in veterinary medicine because, you know, if you've got livestock and their feed gets moldy, then they get very ill. So there's no question that it can do bad things to us. The place where it gets controversial is whether we can inhale enough from moldy buildings to cause these problems. And there's actually good reasons to believe that we can, but the kind of mainstream scientific opinion is that we can't. And that's what doctors typically know. At least to cause, like serious, lasting, non-respiratory problems. So we do know that it can cause allergies and asthma. That's widely accepted. But the kind of conventional mainstream view is that that's all it can do. And really, when you dig into the studies, that there's nothing to back that up. I mean, that's a very kind of thin argument to make. The problem is that it's almost impossible to get any research funding to study non-respiratory effects of mold at this point. And again, it's this kind of self-reinforcing cycle. The mainstream view is that mold can't cause serious non-respiratory problems. Therefore, if you propose to study serious non-respiratory problems, you're clearly a wacko who doesn't understand the science. So we're not going to fund you. So there's no evidence that it causes serious non-respiratory problems. So, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. From around the circle we go. And that's happening in spite of, first of all, there being a quite legitimate scientific case to make that it's very plausible that it does, and the fact that many people are actually experiencing this. So, I was talking to these researchers and dealing with the effects of mold exposures myself, and they were basically, telling me to my face, well, this must just be all in your head. and it's like, one of the things that I did, partly for myself and partly for other people, is I actually conducted a placebo-controlled, double-blind study of my own ability to detect mold. And I did this by having two sets of identical washcloths, one of which had been put in a moldy building and the other of which hadn't. And I had somebody who didn't, somebody chose a washcloth randomly. Another person who didn't know whether it was contaminated or not brought it to me. I held it up to my face. I left it there to see if it, made me sick. And then I said whether I thought it was contaminated or not. And I was so accurate that I would have had only a 2% chance of doing as well if I couldn't in fact detect mold. So that's serious science, that's what you can do to say this is not a placebo effect. And so these researchers would listen to me say that and they'd say, that is kind of the study that you would do. And then they would kind of wander off and they'd start asserting that it was the placebo effect again. It's just very, the thing about science is, of course, science is conducted by human beings, and human beings are reluctant to change their minds. That's just the reality of it. Mm-hmm. And so these things, when an opinion gets really entrenched as kind of the acceptable opinion, it's a very, 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 very hard thing to change, and it takes a long time.
So I'm just wondering if there's other things involved here as well, because if mold is recognized as causing issues, there's going to be more insurance involved, whether that's our insurance to clean up our house or insurance for our health, which
Absolutely.
Right now, it's not recognized as much. So I'm wondering if that is playing a role in limiting even the research on it or the recognition on it.
It's playing a huge role, and in fact, the insurance industry has had a pretty shocking and direct and documented role in all of this. They have promulgated these absolutely scientifically unsound opinions, and they've done it through doctors' professional organizations, and this is I tell this whole story in the book, and I won't go into all the details right now, but basically they got their kind of industry stooges who made literally like hundreds of thousands of dollars from testifying in mold cases, saying that mold could not cause the problems people claimed they did. These people then wrote a document for a doctor's organization that got accepted and widely promulgated and spread, and then the insurance industry, through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a business organization, wrote up a version of this in lay language and sent it to every judge in the country. And as I say, it was all based on extremely flawed science. And over time, eventually, these statements from professional organizations have been removed because legitimate scientists have said, hey, wait, this is totally wrong. We can't be doing this. But there has not been any kind of similar publicity effort. You know, it's not that every judge in the country has gotten a document saying, hey, this was a bunch of hooey. And, you know, that played a huge role in shutting down court cases and also a huge role in creating a general climate of skepticism about the health impacts of mold.
Well, and so I guess the big concern is we're putting everybody's being told they have chronic fatigue syndrome the way you were. And then we've got some people that what is probably one of the issues is that, you know, some people aren't reacting the same way, say, you are. And that was part of your study as well, that you did on yourself, that you had somebody else and they couldn't recognize what was molding and what wasn't because they weren't reacting. So, right. You know, it looks like, well, you're crazy. And I think you even kind of commented this, you're like, I'm one of those moldies because, you know, I can't, you know, I have to walk out of a building or, you
right.
know,
and it makes you feel crazy.
Yeah. And your reaction is different. Something happened for you that made you react in a certain way where other people don't, which I guess would be no different than people that have a peanut allergy. Right. You know, they have to use a certain caution in their lives and do certain things. But I don't think it's being recognized in that way. Right now, it's like, well, you're crazy. Right. You know, you're one of those. And right. I'm using little quotations in there. You're one of those that's going to be right. like that. And, you know, to protect your health, you have to be one of those. But it is also legitimate. I mean, you've proven it. You've not only seen results in your health, but you did that study. I think that was actually great. You did that just to show that it wasn't a placebo effect of what had happened to you, that there was actually something was happening. And there was, you know, there's legitimacy in what you're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was very helpful for me in feeling, you know, solid about what I was saying and being able to kind of defend myself in a scientific context. But, you know, it's such a, like, I'm an unusual case because my reactions are so clear and so fast. And in a way, I mean, you know, if I get exposed, I get paralyzed and it happens very quickly. And in a way, as unpleasant as it is to get paralyzed, it's kind of a blessing because it's something other people can see, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of horrifying.
Yeah.
So it's very helpful on that level to have people have some understanding of what's going on with me. But, you know, for many people, they have a delayed reaction, and it's something that isn't visible to other people. You know, they just feel awful. Or they can't sleep that night, or, you know, particularly when it's a kind of vague symptom that's only inside you, that's not something that you can document on the outside, you know, a headache, pain, fatigue, all of these kinds of things that can be absolutely devastating, but that other people can dismiss and not take seriously. And that, if that's what you're dealing with, if those are the only symptoms you're dealing with, it makes the battle so much harder.
Well, you know, I definitely, and I think that's the why you and I are trying to bring attention to our own experiences, is to help people who are in those situations that are falling through the cracks and,
that's right.
You know, can't get that help. So thank you so much for writing your book and bringing attention to it. If there is anybody who's wanting any more information, is there a way they can get a hold of you or your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is throughtheshadowlands.com, And the book is available, basically everywhere. Amazon, local booksellers, all over the place. And you can follow me on Facebook. I have a public author page, Julie Rehmeyer, that's spelled Rehmeyer. I'm also on Twitter. My handle is Julie Rehmeyer on Twitter. And I love hearing from people, and I'm active both on Facebook and Twitter. So I definitely look forward to connecting with folks.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that we were able to give some people information and maybe help them in their own journey as well, and bring awareness to what's going on and why this situation is the way it is.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been fun.
And I want to thank everybody for listening. Let's be sure to make today a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive. Please join Dr. Rebecca Risk again next Monday at noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We'll talk more next week.